Adrian's head throbbed with the lack of sleep and under-caffeination. He hadn't been able to stomach either the noise or the smells of the hotel breakfast buffet, so he'd opted to grab a coffee on his walk to the office instead. Venti, caramel macchiato, extra shot, no whip, for Aaron? Adrian blinked blearily, struggling to focus past the tightening band of his tension headache. The girl at the counter looked at him expectantly. Venti, for Aaron? She said again, waving the drink. Extra shot, no whip. It was the right drink, but the wrong name, and when no one else stepped up, he surged forward clumsily. A little advice, Aaron? You drink too many of these and you're gonna have a heart attack, she said when he reached out for it. That's 4 shots. Nobody needs 4 shots. Maybe Aaron didn't need 4 shots, but Adrian most definitely did. He grunted out a non-committal agreement and took it from her. He felt halfway to a heart attack anyway, so surely the coffee could only help. He'd been feverish when he woke up, and since then he'd swung back and forth between cold sweats and pins and needles all over his body. If he didn't know better, he'd say he had a hangover between the pounding head and the way his stomach roiled at the scent of breakfast. But he'd called it an early night after his run after dinner yesterday, and relaxed in bed with a minibar snack that had definitely not included any alcohol. Adrian took a sip of his coffee as he stopped at the crosswalk and waited for the light to change. He nearly heaved when the bitter liquid spilled across his tongue. He'd ordered this drink a dozen times, and it had always been sweet and smooth. Nothing like this. The taste of burned coffee lingered in his mouth, held there by a syrupy residue he could feel like a weight against his tongue. He scraped his teeth against it, trying to rid himself of the sensation. This entire day had been a nightmare, and he'd only been up for an hour. Even the hot shower he'd tried to take to loosen his tense muscles and ease his headache had been a disaster. The water had hit his skin like tiny missiles, leaving him feeling tender and raw afterward. When the light changed, Adrian moved across the wide street. The man closest to him must have had his Bluetooth headset turned up to 11. Adrian could hear every word. He glanced over, surprised the nicely dressed businessman wasn't more concerned about privacy. From what Adrian could hear, it sounded like the man was listening to a pretty lurid audiobook. Nobody around them looked the slightest bit scandalized. The book would have raised some eyebrows even in his liberal hometown of Portland, but it got nary a sideways glance here in the heartland. Lost in thought, Adrian brought his foot down hard on the curb and almost went sprawling. The businessman he'd been watching grabbed him by the elbow and kept him on his feet, but the motion knocked one of his earbuds out. Adrian cringed as the audiobook played even louder. The businessman gave him a concerned glance once he'd steadied him on the sidewalk, but Adrian waved him off with a quick thanks. The book continued to play, muted slightly when the man tucked the earbud back into place. The world seemed to slow. Adrian's vision reduced to sparkling dust motes and the swirl of exhaust from a passing bus. He stumbled to his stop, slack-jawed. No one had heard. That's why they hadn't reacted. The man had been listening at a normal volume, and even when the earbud had fallen out, no one had noticed because it hadn't been audible, except to Adrian. Adrian rubbed his hand across his face and stepped to the side to avoid the tide of people. What was going on? He was used to seeing his packmates react to things outside the register he could process, but he'd obviously never experienced it himself. Had that been the problem at the hotel, too? Maybe a herd of elephants hadn't moved into the room above his. Maybe he'd just been hearing normal footsteps, amplified, to an almost unbearable level. He'd never given much thought to how sharp werewolf senses must be. He'd seen his sister flinch when fire alarms went off and noticed how irritable his family could get when they were in a loud, crowded restaurant. But mostly, the werewolves he knew adapted to their heightened senses. They carried earplugs and invested in fancy noise-canceling headphones to help them focus when they needed to. The walls in the house he grew up in had been soundproofed, as was standard in most werewolf households. And they avoided apartment buildings and condos like the plague. If he'd been experiencing enhanced werewolf hearing last night, he couldn't blame the person on the next floor for being loud. But that couldn't be what was happening. He didn't know of anyone who'd had werewolf senses but lacked the ability to shift. Not that he personally knew of anyone born to werewolf parents who was human, like him. Young wolflings were essentially human. The hormones that prompted the shift weren't produced until they went through their second puberty, on the first full moon after their 19th birthday. But before that, they were vulnerable to human illnesses and needed human vaccinations. Blood tests would reveal nothing spectacular about them. But after their second puberty, the turn as they called it, the hormones that drove the shift were detectable in their blood. When he'd failed to turn, Adrian had seen a parade of doctors. He'd had scores of tests and second and even third opinions. His mother had refused to accept the diagnosis until she'd hauled him to a werewolf endocrinologist. The results had been conclusive, and his family had been horrified. There was no room for doubt. Adrian's blood had no traces of anything outside the norm. He was perfectly healthy and 100% human. He swallowed hard, fighting nausea and from the scent of the cooling coffee he was still holding. His head pounded and his muscles and joints ached. He was coming down with the flu. That had to be it. Maybe he should just go back to his room so he didn't get his staffer sick. A bus passed and Adrian's stomach turned at the scent of the fumes. Decision made, he did an about-face and turned back to the stoplight. He'd head back to the hotel, take a nap. Maybe that would help. Adrian clenched his hands, recoiling when the sharp bite of nails bit through his skin. The ferrous scent of blood made him gag. He shouldn't be strong enough to break skin so easily, and he definitely shouldn't be able to smell such a small amount of blood. He couldn't explain this away as the flu. He was definitely turning. A wave of dizziness sent his head spinning as he crossed the street, but this time there wasn't a kindly businessman nearby to stop his fall. Adrian went down hard, right in the middle of the crosswalk.